The alien fleet blocked every human signal. Humans don't need signals. The moment my comm board went black, I knew something was wrong. Not the ordinary kind of wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your stomach drop before your brain even understands why. My name is Mara Voss, and I was standing on the bridge of the Kestrel Dawn when the sky tore open. 1 second we were running a routine patrol along the edge of human space. The next second, space itself seemed to fold, and out of that fold came ships. Hundreds of them, maybe more. They did not look like anything from any catalog I had studied. Long, curved hulls the color of wet stone, moving with a strange, silent grace that felt almost insulting, as if they knew they did not need to hurry. Grace Whitfield, my communications officer, was the first to speak. Her voice came out flat, controlled, the way we are all trained to sound even when our hands are shaking. "Signal loss," she said. "Everything. Radio, laser link, even the emergency band." I looked at the display. She was right. Every channel that connected us to the rest of the fleet, to command, to anyone, had gone silent. Not damaged, not glitching. Silenced, on purpose, all at once, like someone had reached out and pressed a hand over our mouths. For a moment, nobody on the bridge moved. I could hear the hum of the ship around me, the quiet clicks of instruments still working, still gathering information even though they had nowhere to send it. I thought about my sister back home, about the last message I had sent her, wondering if it had even arrived before the silence fell. Ethan Cole, my pilot, turned in his seat. His knuckles were pale on the controls. "Commander," he said, "what do we do if we can't call for help?" I looked at him, and for one heartbeat, I let myself feel the fear too. Then I pushed it down, because that is the job. That is what the uniform means. "We do what we trained for," I said. "We don't need help. We need a plan." Saying it out loud steadied me more than I expected. It steadied the whole bridge too. I saw shoulders straighten, saw hands stop trembling, because the truth is, every one of us had drilled for this exact nightmare 100 times before. In simulations, in classrooms, in long nights of training that felt pointless until now. The alien fleet did not attack right away. They simply sat there, filling the black in front of us, patient and enormous, as if they were waiting for something. I would learn later that they were waiting for panic. They were waiting for confusion. They were waiting for exactly the kind of chaos that had won them every battle before this one. They had no idea they were about to meet a species that had spent its entire history preparing for the day the network would fail. I ordered Grace to keep trying every frequency, every old protocol, every trick from the manuals nobody reads until they have to. Not because I believed it would work, but because it kept her hands busy and her mind sharp. Meanwhile, I turned to the one thing that still worked no matter what. The plan already sitting in my head, memorized, long before this day, waiting for exactly this moment. Every ship in the fleet carried what we called the silent doctrine. It was not a single order. It was hundreds of small decisions, already made in advance, so that no one would ever need to ask permission in the middle of a crisis. Rally points, timing windows, fallback positions, all of it built on a single idea, drilled into every cadet from their first day of training. Never trust the network to survive contact. I remember my old instructor, a stern man named Daniel Cross, standing in front of my class years ago, tapping a stick against a star chart. "One day," he had said, "someone is going to figure out that you can win a war by cutting the wires. When that day comes, you will not panic. You will remember your training, and you will move without being told, because the mission does not stop just because the voice giving orders goes quiet." At the time, it had felt like just another lecture, standing on the bridge of the Kestrel Dawn with an alien fleet blotting out the stars. It felt like the most important thing anyone had ever taught me. I gave the order to begin the sequence, not spoken over any channel, because there were no channels left. Instead, I gave it the old way. A flashing light on our hull, a pattern known to every human ship in the sector, repeated 3 times, slow enough to be read, fast enough not to waste a second. Across the black, I saw an answering flicker from a distant hull. Then another, spreading outward like a wave, ship after ship confirming they had seen the signal and understood, without a single word passing between us. The alien fleet, I imagine, watched our sensors go dark and assumed we had been broken. What they could not see was that we had simply stopped talking and started moving. On the bridge, Grace looked up from her useless console, and for the first time since the ships appeared, she smiled. "They think they won already," she said. I almost smiled too. Almost. "Let them think that," I said. "It buys us time." I ordered Ethan to bring us onto the old heading, the one memorized during 100 drills, calculated by hand, using the position of distant stars, instead of a navigation computer that depended on signals we no longer had. It felt strange, watching him work with paper charts and a stylus, instead of a glowing display feeding him coordinates. Strange, but not helpless. Every mark he made was steady and sure. Meanwhile, on the lower deck, our engineer, a quiet young woman named Sophie Marsh, was already preparing the physical relay drives, the small data cores we used to carry information between ships when all else failed. It sounded almost too simple to work in a war fought with ships the size of small moons. A person, carrying a drive, moving between vessels in a small shuttle, delivering information the old-fashioned way. But simple things survive when complicated things break. I walked the length of the ship that first hour, checking on every station, every crew member, watching how they handled the silence. Some were nervous, most were calm. All of them were working, because the plan gave them something to hold on to besides fear. It struck me then how strange it must look to the aliens outside. A fleet gone quiet, moving with total precision, without a single voice connecting one ship to another. To them, silence probably meant surrender, or collapse, or fear. They had no way of knowing that for us, silence was simply another language, one we had spent generations learning to speak. I thought about the history lessons from my childhood, the stories of ships running deep and silent beneath oceans, long before humanity ever left its homeworld, refusing to make a sound so that no enemy could find them, trusting their crews completely, because there was no other choice. I thought about old resistance movements, cut off from any central command, moving on nothing but trust and memorized plans, striking exactly where and when they needed to, without ever needing a single order shouted across a wire. We were not improvising, we were remembering. Hours passed. The alien fleet still had not moved to attack, and I began to understand why. They were confused. Their sensors, built to detect chatter and coordination, saw nothing from us, and yet somehow our ships kept drifting into new positions, aligning with a precision that should have been impossible without communication. I imagined, somewhere on one of those strange curved hulls, an alien officer staring at readings that made no sense, trying to understand how a fleet with no signals could still be moving as one. Let them wonder, I thought. Let them spend their patience trying to solve a puzzle that was never meant to have an answer they could find. Grace finally gave up trying the old channels, and instead began preparing something else entirely. A message not meant for the aliens, not meant for command, but meant for us. She began compiling everything we had learned in that first hour, everything our sensors had recorded about the enemy fleet, so it could be carried by hand to the next ship, and the next, and the next, until every human vessel in the sector had the same picture without a single wave of radio ever passing between us. It was slow. It was old-fashioned. It worked. By the end of that first day, though no orders had been spoken aloud in hours, every human ship in the sector understood three things clearly. We knew where the enemy fleet was. We knew what our next move needed to be, and we knew, without needing to be told, that none of us intended to give up. I stood at the viewport near the end of that long, silent day, watching the alien fleet glow faintly against the stars, patient and unaware. I thought about how strange it was that the very thing meant to break us, the loss of every signal we relied on, had instead pulled us together tighter than any order ever could. Ethan came to stand beside me, his charts finally rolled up and set aside. "Do you think they know yet?" he asked quietly. "What they're actually facing?" I looked out at the ships blocking every star ahead of us, silent and confident, still waiting for a panic that was never going to come. "Not yet," I said, "but they will." Behind me, I heard the quiet click of another relay drive being prepared, another quiet decision already made, another piece of a plan moving forward without a single word needing to be spoken. The silence that was supposed to be our nightmare had become something else entirely. It had become our language, our weapon, and our promise, all at once. Somewhere out there, in one of those long curved ships, an alien fleet sat waiting for humanity to fall apart. I almost felt sorry for them, almost, because they had just made the one mistake no enemy of humanity should ever make. They had assumed that silence meant weakness. They were about to learn just how wrong that assumption could be. My name is Veltharu, and for 300 cycles, I served as a tactical analyst for the Thren Compact. I am writing this account now because someone should understand what really happened out there, before the stories get twisted into something simpler than the truth. I had studied humans for many cycles before that day. Our archives held reports on dozens of species, and every single one shared the same weakness once you understood how to find it. Cut their signals, and you cut their minds from each other. It worked on the Dral hive networks, whose warriors froze in place the instant their shared thoughts went quiet. It worked on the Kesset swarms, whose ships collided with each other in blind confusion the moment their guiding beacon fell silent. It worked on nearly every enemy the Compact had ever faced, because nearly every enemy the Compact had ever faced depended completely on staying connected to think clearly at all. Our doctrine was built on this single, reliable truth. A fleet without its network is a fleet without its will. Silence the signals, and the enemy becomes a collection of frightened individuals instead of a coordinated force. When our scouts first identified the human fleet at the edge of that quiet sector, I remember reviewing their communication patterns with something close to boredom. Their ships relied on constant chatter, endless streams of coordinates and instructions passing between vessels every few moments. To my eyes, this looked like exactly the kind of weakness we had exploited 100 times before, perhaps even more so, since humans seemed to talk more than any species we had studied. I recommended the jamming field be deployed immediately upon arrival, full strength, covering every known human frequency, along with several backup protocols we suspected they might use in emergencies. My superiors agreed without hesitation. It was, after all, standard procedure, a proven strategy, a guaranteed victory before the first weapon was ever fired. I remember the moment the field activated. Our sensors showed every human channel going dark within seconds, exactly as predicted. I allowed myself a small measure of satisfaction, the kind that comes from watching a plan unfold exactly as designed. Then I waited for the panic to show itself. It did not come. At first, I assumed our instruments were simply slow to detect it. Confusion often takes a short while to manifest as visible chaos, ships drifting out of formation, weapons firing without coordination, vessels colliding as their crews lost the shared awareness that had guided them before. I told my superiors to be patient. The chaos would come. It always did. An hour passed, then 2, then a full cycle of our ship's clock, and still, the human fleet showed no signs of the disorder we expected. If anything, their formations seemed to tighten rather than scatter. I remember staring at the sensor readings, checking and rechecking them, certain there must be some error in our equipment. There was no error. The humans were simply doing something I had never seen any species do before. They were moving in coordination without any signal connecting them at all. I brought this observation to my commanding officer, a stern and experienced strategist named Korath, who dismissed my concerns with the confidence of someone who had won 1,000 battles using the same tested methods. They are simply drifting on old momentum, Korath told me. Ships already in formation before the jamming began will hold their positions for a short while out of habit. It means nothing. Wait, and you will see them scatter like every other species we have silenced. I wanted to believe him. Our doctrine had never failed before, and doctrine built on 100 victories is difficult to question. But something in the readings troubled me. The human ships were not simply holding old positions. They were changing positions, subtly, deliberately, adjusting their formation in ways that suggested active decision-making, not frozen momentum. I requested closer sensor sweeps, and what I found unsettled me more than anything in my long career studying enemy fleets. The human vessels were exchanging something, but not through any signal our instruments could detect. Small shuttles moved briefly between larger ships, before returning to their original positions. Flashes of light, brief and rhythmic, passed between hulls in patterns too structured to be random damage or malfunction. They were talking to each other, I realized, just not in any language we knew how to listen for. I brought this discovery to Korath again, more urgently this time. He studied the reports with a slight frown, the first sign of doubt I had seen from him since the operation began. "Impossible," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "No fleet coordinates effectively through such primitive methods, lights and physical couriers. It is not efficient enough to matter." "Perhaps," I said. "They built their entire strategy around not needing efficiency in the moment we chose to attack it." Korath did not respond to that. I do not think he had an answer. Over the following cycles, our confusion only deepened. The human fleet continued moving with a precision that should have been impossible without coordination, yet every attempt to detect that coordination through familiar means failed completely. It was as if we were watching a puzzle solve itself without ever seeing the pieces move. I began to study their history more closely during those long hours, searching our archives for any clue to explain what we were witnessing. What I found disturbed me deeply. Human military history was filled with examples of exactly this kind of behavior, going back centuries before they ever developed the ability to leave their homeworld. Vessels moving beneath their oceans in complete silence, trusting their crews to act correctly without any outside guidance. Small groups of resistance fighters, cut off entirely from any central authority, coordinating attacks against larger forces, using nothing but memorized plans and complete trust in one another. This was not a fleet caught off guard by our tactic. This was a fleet that had spent its entire history preparing for exactly this moment. I remember sitting alone in my quarters that cycle, staring at the ceiling, turning over a single unsettling thought. Every species the Compact had ever silenced into defeat had built its strength around connection. Humans, it seemed, had built their strength around the assumption that connection could be taken away at any moment, and had trained accordingly for centuries. We had not found their weakness. We had walked directly into the one scenario they had spent their entire history preparing to survive. I brought my concerns to Korath one final time, urging him to reconsider our approach before committing to a full engagement. He listened this time, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to caution. "What do you suggest?" he asked. I suggested we consider ending the jamming field, restoring their signals, and observing whether their coordination depended on some hidden channel we had simply failed to detect. If their precision vanished the moment true communication became possible again, it would confirm they had been relying on some clever trick, not genuine independent coordination. Korath considered this for a long moment, before shaking his head slowly. "If we restore their signals now," he said, "and their coordination does not depend on secret communication at all, we will have given them exactly what makes them dangerous. Full information sharing, on top of whatever ability allows them to function perfectly well without it." He was right to worry. I did not have a good answer for him. Whatever the humans were doing, it worked exactly as well with their signals cut as it likely would with their signals restored. We had taken away their voice, and somehow, they had kept speaking anyway, in a language built entirely on trust, memory, and preparation. I watched, over the following cycles, as our confidence in the jamming strategy slowly crumbled. Reports came in of human strike craft appearing exactly where our supply routes were weakest, striking with precision that suggested detailed planning rather than lucky guesses. Our own forces, meanwhile, began to suffer the very confusion we had hoped to inflict on them. Our jamming field, designed to silence human signals, had also disrupted portions of our own command network, cutting our central ships off from frontline vessels in ways we had not fully anticipated. It was a strange and uncomfortable realization. In trying to silence an enemy built to survive silence, we had partially silenced ourselves, an enemy never designed for such conditions at all. I remember writing in my private logs during that difficult cycle, trying to capture the shifting fear I felt as our advantage slipped away. We had spent generations perfecting a strategy that worked, because every enemy we faced depended on connection to think clearly. We had never once considered what might happen if we encountered a species that had spent its own history perfecting the opposite skill entirely. Korath called a full strategy session shortly after, gathering every senior officer aboard our command vessel to reassess the situation. I remember the tension in that room, the quiet realization spreading across every face present that our proven doctrine, tested across 100 victories, had met something it was never designed to defeat. One of my colleagues, a younger analyst named Sethrin, spoke the words that none of us wanted to say aloud. "We assumed silence was a weapon that only worked one way," he said. "Against them, It appears to be nothing at all. Korath did not respond immediately. He simply stared at the tactical display, watching human ships continue their strange, silent, perfectly coordinated movements, closing in on our supply lines with a confidence that felt, to all of us, deeply unsettling. I do not know, even now, whether restoring their signals would have changed anything at all. Perhaps it would have made no difference whatsoever, since their coordination clearly did not depend on any channel we could detect or disrupt. Perhaps it would have made things worse, giving them full information alongside whatever hidden strength allowed them to function without it. What I do know is this. We came expecting to face another frightened, disconnected enemy, scattered and confused the moment we silenced their signals. Instead, we found a species that had built its entire history around surviving exactly this kind of silence, one that treated the loss of every signal not as a crisis to panic over, but as a familiar challenge it had trained for since long before any of us had ever heard the word human. I close this account with a single warning for anyone who reads it after me. Do not assume silence is always a weakness. For some enemies, it is simply another language, one they have spent their entire existence learning to speak fluently, long before you ever thought to test it against them. By the third day of silence, I had stopped thinking of it as silence at all. My name is Mara Voss, and what I once feared as an empty void of dead channels had slowly become something else in my mind, a rhythm, a shared heartbeat between ships that no longer needed words to understand each other. The Kestrel Dawn moved through the dark alongside a dozen other vessels, each one holding position with a precision that would have looked, to any outside observer, exactly like coordinated communication. It was not. It was memory, repetition, and trust, working together the way they had been trained to for years. Sophie Marsh approached me on the bridge that morning, carrying a small data drive in her hand, the physical kind we had begun relying on more heavily with each passing day. "Commander," she said, "the courier shuttle just returned from the Halloway. They confirmed receipt of our sensor readings from yesterday. Their navigator cross-checked our position estimates against theirs. We are aligned within a small margin, well inside acceptable range." I nodded, taking the drive from her hand. It felt strange, holding a small physical object that carried information across the black instead of a wave of light or radio. Strange, but reassuring in its own way. A drive could not be jammed. A drive could not be intercepted from a distance. It simply had to be carried, quietly, carefully, from one hull to another. We had built, over those first days, an entire network of these couriers. Small shuttles moving between ships on careful schedules, never announced, never broadcast, simply understood by every crew because the timing had been agreed upon long before the alien fleet had ever arrived. Every ship knew when to expect a courier, where to meet it, and what to do with the information it carried. It was slow compared to the instant communication we had lost, but slow and certain beat fast and broken every single time. Ethan Cole guided us that day toward a position we had chosen, through hours of careful hand calculation, using nothing but the fixed points of distant stars and the steady tick of our onboard clock. I watched him work, his movements calm and practiced, and I felt a quiet pride in how naturally he had adapted to methods that most of our generation had only read about in old training manuals. "Do you ever wonder," he asked without looking up from his charts, "what they must be thinking over there? Watching us move like this with no way to explain it." I glanced toward the viewport, toward the distant glow of alien hulls still holding their position at the edge of the sector. "I hope they're wondering a lot," I said. "Confusion buys us time, and time is the only thing we have plenty of right now." He smiled slightly at that, then returned to his calculations. Grace Whitfield spent much of her time during those days compiling everything we gathered into careful, condensed reports, small enough to fit on a single data drive, clear enough that any commanding officer on any ship could understand our situation within moments of receiving it. It was tedious work, requiring far more patience than simply speaking a message aloud over an open channel. But it worked, and more importantly, it worked reliably. Admiral Halverson, commanding the fleet from a position several systems away, had established what we began calling the anchor points. These were prearranged locations, chosen long before this crisis, where ships were expected to gather at specific intervals if communication ever failed completely. It was part of the same doctrine drilled into every officer since basic training: The same doctrine that now felt less like a distant lesson, and more like the only thing standing between us and disaster. I had never met Halverson in person, only reviewed his service record during officer training. Stories described him as a careful, deliberate strategist who believed deeply in preparation over improvisation. Looking at how smoothly our fleet had adapted to total signal loss, I understood exactly why that reputation had followed him through his career. On the fourth day, our courier shuttle returned from a rendezvous with a scout vessel, positioned closer to the alien fleet than any of our other ships dared approach. The pilot, a quiet young man named Oliver Hunt, delivered his report directly to me on the bridge, his voice low and careful. "Commander," he said, "the scout reports increased activity along the alien fleet's forward line, ships repositioning more frequently than before. It could mean they are preparing something. It could also mean their own coordination is beginning to suffer." I considered this carefully. If our understanding of their doctrine was correct, the alien fleet depended heavily on constant, instant communication between their vessels. Their own jamming field, meant to silence us, would inevitably create difficulties for their internal coordination as well, especially across such a vast formation. If that theory held true, we were not the only fleet struggling to adapt to a strange new reality. We might simply be handling it far better than they expected. I called a quiet meeting on the bridge that evening, gathering my senior officers around a simple paper chart instead of a glowing digital display. It felt oddly appropriate, discussing our next move using tools our ancestors might have recognized from centuries before any of us were born. Grace spoke first, laying out everything gathered from the couriers over the past several days. Sophie followed with details on our remaining supplies and the condition of our small fleet of shuttles. Ethan offered his calculations on possible approach vectors toward the alien supply lines, routes chosen based purely on stellar positioning, rather than any live sensor feed we no longer had access to. I listened carefully to each report, weighing them against the plan already forming in my mind. A plan built not on new information exactly, but on trust in the framework we had all trained for long before this crisis began. "We move forward with the Silent Doctrine's third stage," I said finally. "Coordinated pressure on their supply lines, executed independently by each ship according to pre-agreed timing. No further confirmation required beyond what the couriers have already delivered." Grace nodded immediately, already preparing the final data drive that would carry this decision to the other ships in our small formation. There was no hesitation in the room, no uncertainty about whether the plan would work. Only the quiet confidence of people who had rehearsed this exact scenario more times than they could count, waiting patiently for the day it would actually matter. I sent Oliver out one final time that evening, carrying the last data drive toward the Halloway and 2 other nearby vessels, confirming the timing everyone would need for what came next. I watched his small shuttle disappear into the dark, a single point of light moving silently between massive ships, carrying nothing more than a few words of confirmation that would set an entire coordinated effort into motion, without a single wave of radio ever being sent. Later that night, standing alone near the viewport, I thought again about Veltharu's fleet, somewhere out there in the dark, still waiting, still confused, still searching for a signal that simply did not exist in the way they expected. I thought about my old instructor, Daniel Cross, and the words he had repeated so many times during training that they had become almost meaningless through repetition, until this exact moment brought them back with startling clarity. The mission does not stop just because the voice giving orders goes quiet. He had been right. Every step, every careful calculation, every quiet courier moving silently between ships, all of it proved the same simple truth. We did not need a voice to keep moving forward together. We needed only the plan we had already built, the trust we had already earned, and the patience to let both carry us the rest of the way. Ethan approached me quietly as the ship settled into its next scheduled rest period, the crew rotating through careful shifts to stay sharp for whatever came next. "Do you think it's working?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. I looked out at the distant glow of alien hulls, still holding their position, still waiting for a chaos that refused to arrive. "I think," I said slowly, "that we've already won the only battle that mattered before a single weapon was ever fired. We proved we don't need them to prove we can function." He nodded, seeming to understand exactly what I meant, and returned to his post without another word. The days that followed brought a strange kind of peace to our small fleet, despite the enormous danger surrounding us. There was comfort in routine, comfort in trust, comfort in knowing that every ship around us was moving with the same quiet determination, following the same careful plan, waiting for the same moment we had all trained our entire careers to recognize. Somewhere ahead of us, an alien fleet sat confused, waiting for a collapse that had already failed to happen days ago. Behind us, dozens of human ships moved with quiet, patient precision, gathering strength, gathering position, preparing for a moment that was coming, whether the aliens understood it or not. I did not know exactly what would happen once our plan reached its final stage, but I knew, with a certainty that had grown stronger every single day since the silence first fell, that whatever came next, we would face it exactly the way we had trained to. Together, quietly, and completely unafraid of a darkness that had once seemed like our greatest weakness, and had instead become our greatest strength. My name is Admiral Halverson, and I have spent more years than I care to count preparing for a day I hoped would never actually arrive. Standing now on the bridge of my flagship, watching reports arrive one careful data drive at a time, instead of in the instant flashes of light I had grown used to over my long career, I found myself thinking not of fear, but of every lesson that had led me to this exact moment. I joined the fleet as a young officer many years ago, long before anyone imagined an enemy capable of silencing every human channel across an entire sector at once. Even then, our instructors spoke of this possibility as an inevitability rather than a mere risk. I remember one lecture in particular, delivered by a veteran officer whose name has faded from memory, but whose words never have. Every network fails eventually, he told us. Whether through enemy action or simple mechanical failure, the day will come when you cannot hear your commander's voice, and your commander cannot hear yours. On that day, the only thing that matters is whether you already know what to do. At the time, it felt like a hypothetical exercise, a thought experiment meant to keep young officers humble. Standing here now, decades later, watching an alien fleet believe it had silenced us into helplessness, I understood exactly why that lecture had been given with such seriousness. Human military history is filled with moments when connection failed and preparation carried the day instead. I thought often, during those long silent days, of old accounts describing vessels that once traveled beneath the oceans of our home world, submarines whose crews would sometimes go without any outside contact for weeks at a time, trusting entirely in their training and their captain's judgment to guide them safely through hostile waters. Those crews did not panic in the absence of instructions. They executed the mission they already understood, adjusting only the details as circumstances required. I thought too of resistance networks from earlier human conflicts, small groups operating without any central command structure at all, relying instead on shared understanding of overall goals and complete trust in one another, to accomplish objectives no single voice could have coordinated in real time. Those networks succeeded not because they lacked structure, but because their structure lived inside every individual member, rather than depending on constant instruction from above. This philosophy became the foundation of what we eventually formalized as the Silent Doctrine, a framework built into every level of human fleet training, long before this crisis began. The doctrine assumed, correctly as it turned out, that any sufficiently advanced enemy might eventually discover the value of cutting communication before ever engaging in direct conflict. Rather than treating this possibility as an unlikely edge case, we built our entire command culture around ensuring it would never matter, no matter how completely our signals might be silenced. Every officer under my command had trained extensively in what we called mission intent, rather than direct instruction. Instead of memorizing specific orders for specific situations, they learned to understand the underlying purpose behind every operation so completely that they could make correct decisions independently, confident their choices would align with what their commander would have ordered had communication remained possible. I remember explaining this philosophy once to a visiting diplomat who found our approach unusual compared to what she understood of other fleet doctrines. Most militaries fear losing control of their forces, she said. Your entire system seems built around expecting to lose that control regularly, and simply trusting it will not matter. I told her then, and I believe it just as strongly now, that control was always something of an illusion in the vast distances and uncertain conditions of space combat. True strength came not from maintaining perfect control at all times, but from building a force capable of acting correctly, even when that control inevitably slipped away. Watching reports arrive from Commander Voss and the other captains under my command during those difficult early days, I saw this philosophy proven correct in ways I had hoped for but never fully expected to witness firsthand. Ship after ship adapted to total signal loss, not through desperate improvisation, but through calm execution of plans already understood by every crew member long before the crisis began. The couriers moving quietly between our vessels reminded me of something else from human history as well. An older method of warfare from centuries before space travel existed at all, when messages traveled by physical means across vast distances, carried by individuals willing to risk everything to ensure information reached its destination safely. We had rebuilt this ancient practice using modern shuttles and careful timing, but the underlying principle remained exactly the same. Information does not require instant transmission to remain valuable, provided the receiving party understands how to use it once it finally arrives. I spent long hours during those early days reviewing every data drive delivered to my flagship, piecing together a picture of the alien fleet's movements and confusion through careful analysis rather than live sensor feeds. It was slower than the instant awareness I had grown accustomed to throughout my career, but it proved remarkably effective once I adjusted my expectations accordingly. One report in particular caught my attention during the fourth day of the crisis. A scout vessel positioned closer to the alien formation than any other human ship had observed unusual patterns in their movement, suggesting difficulties coordinating their own forces, despite presumably retaining full communication capability among themselves. I called my senior staff together that evening to discuss this development, gathering around the same simple paper charts that Commander Voss had described using aboard her own vessel. There was something almost comforting in returning to these older methods, a reminder that our doctrine had prepared us, not just to survive without our usual tools, but to function just as effectively using older ones instead. My tactical officer, a thoughtful woman named Claire Dunn, offered an observation that stayed with me throughout the remainder of the crisis. Their jamming field disrupts an area encompassing their own fleet as thoroughly as it disrupts ours, she said. If their command structure depends on constant coordination the way ours depends on independent judgment, they may be suffering more from this situation than we are, despite technically retaining more capability than we currently have. This possibility struck me as both fascinating and strategically significant. If true, it meant the very weapon deployed against us might be causing greater harm to the fleet that had chosen to use it, simply because that fleet had never trained to function without its usual advantages the way we had. I ordered increased scouting activity along the edges of the alien formation, carried out carefully and cautiously to avoid provoking direct confrontation before we were fully prepared. Each scouting mission returned with additional evidence supporting Claire's theory. The alien fleet showed signs of internal confusion, ships repositioning inefficiently, formations shifting in ways that suggested uncertainty rather than deliberate strategy. I began drafting the next phase of our response during those days, building carefully upon the foundation Commander Voss and other captains had already established through their independent execution of early doctrine stages. The plan required no new communication breakthrough, no clever workaround to restore lost signals. It required only the same patient trust and preparation that had carried us successfully through the crisis so far. I thought often, during the quiet hours of those difficult days, about the alien commanders somewhere out there in the dark, watching their sensors, waiting for a collapse among our forces that would simply never arrive. I wondered whether they understood yet what kind of enemy they had actually chosen to silence, or whether they still believed their proven strategy would eventually produce the results it had always produced against every other species they had faced before us. I hoped, honestly, that they did not understand yet. Every day of continued confusion on their part gave us additional time to prepare our next move, time we intended to use fully before finally revealing exactly how completely their strategy had failed against an enemy built specifically to survive it. Claire approached me late one evening as I reviewed the latest batch of courier reports, her expression thoughtful rather than concerned. "Admiral," she said, "do you think they will eventually restore our communications, hoping to gain some advantage from seeing how we respond once we regain that capability?" It was a fair question, one I had considered myself more than once during those long days. I told her honestly that I did not know for certain, but that it likely would not matter a great deal either way. We built this doctrine assuming the silence might last indefinitely, I said. If they restore our signals, we will use them gladly. If they do not, we will continue exactly as we have been, because our plan never depended on their choice in the first place. She nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer, and returned to her duties without further discussion. Standing alone on the bridge later that night, watching the quiet activity of officers working carefully through old-fashioned methods that somehow felt entirely natural despite their unfamiliarity, I found myself reflecting on just how much preparation had shaped this moment. Decades of training, generations of doctrine passed down from officer to officer, all of it building toward a crisis none of us had truly expected to face, yet all of us had somehow been ready for, regardless. I thought of my own instructors from years before, long since retired or passed on, who had spent their careers drilling lessons into young officers that must have seemed, at the time, like unlikely hypothetical scenarios. I hoped, wherever they were now, that they understood just how thoroughly their teaching had prepared us for exactly this moment. The alien fleet outside continued waiting patiently for a chaos that would never come, still confident in a strategy that had served them well against every enemy they had previously encountered. They had no way of knowing, not yet, that they had finally encountered a species built from its very foundation to treat silence, not as a weakness to fear, but as simply another condition to prepare for, patiently and thoroughly, long before the day it would ever actually matter. I closed my log for that evening with a single simple note, one I intended to review again once this crisis finally reached its conclusion. Preparation, I wrote, is a language spoken fluently only by those willing to practice it long before anyone ever forces them to use it. Tonight, I am grateful beyond measure that we chose, so many years ago, to practice it thoroughly. The moment I received the final courier confirmation, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet certainty, replacing the careful patience I had carried for days. My name is Mara Voss, and standing on the bridge of the Kestrel Dawn, I finally understood that our long period of careful waiting was about to end. Oliver Hunt delivered the drive personally, having piloted his small shuttle through a careful, quiet route, designed to avoid any possibility of detection by the alien fleet's sensors. He handed it to Grace Whitfield without a word, both of them understanding the significance of what it likely contained without needing any explanation. Grace reviewed the contents quickly, her expression shifting from careful neutrality to quiet determination within moments. "Commander," she said, "Admiral Halverson has confirmed timing for the next phase. Every ship in our formation received identical confirmation through their own scheduled couriers over the past several hours. We move on his mark, synchronized across every vessel in the sector." I felt the weight of that moment settle over the bridge. Days of quiet preparation, careful calculation, and patient trust in a system built long before any of us had known we would need it, all of it converging toward this single coordinated action. Ethan Cole looked up from his charts, his expression calm, despite the tension clearly visible in his posture. "What's our position relative to their supply line?" he asked. I studied the careful hand calculations he had maintained throughout our days of silence, cross-referencing them against the timing confirmed in Grace's report. "We're exactly where we need to be," I said. "Bring us to final approach heading," quietly. He nodded and began adjusting our course with the same careful precision he had shown throughout the entire crisis, using nothing but stellar positioning and steady calculation to guide us toward a destination none of us could confirm through any live sensor feed. I thought, as our ship moved silently through the dark, about everything that had led to this moment. Days of adaptation, careful courier runs between vessels, quiet confirmation of a plan built on trust rather than instant communication. All of it had prepared us for exactly this moment, a coordinated action across dozens of ships without a single word passing between us through any channel the alien fleet could detect or disrupt. Sophie Marsh appeared on the bridge shortly after, having completed her final preparations in engineering. "Everything is ready, Commander," she said. "Whatever happens next, the ship will perform exactly as it should." I thanked her quietly, appreciating the steady confidence she had maintained throughout our long days of uncertainty. It was easy to forget, sometimes, how much depended on people like Sophie, working carefully behind the scenes, ensuring every system functioned properly, even without the constant stream of updates and confirmations we had once relied upon. As we approached our final position, I found myself thinking again of Veltharu's fleet, still holding its patient formation somewhere ahead of us, still waiting for a collapse that had never come and never would. I wondered what their sensors were showing them in this moment, whether they had noticed the subtle shifting of human ships across the sector, quietly converging toward positions that would only make sense once our coordinated action finally began. Grace's console, still dark and silent after so many days of disconnection, suddenly flickered with something new. Not a restored signal exactly, but a simple, prearranged light pattern from a nearby vessel, confirming its own position and readiness for the moment ahead. "They're in position," Grace said quietly. "All of them." I looked out at the darkness surrounding us, imagining dozens of human ships scattered across the sector, each one holding perfectly to a plan established days before, waiting for the same moment we were waiting for now, trusting completely in a system built specifically to survive silence, rather than depend on constant reassurance. The timing, when it finally arrived, came not through any dramatic announcement, but through the simple passage of the clock we had all been counting silently in our own heads for hours. Ethan glanced at his chronometer, then looked toward me with quiet readiness. "Mark," he said simply. I nodded, and without another word, our ship began its final approach, moving alongside dozens of others scattered across the sector, all of us converging toward the alien fleet's supply lines with a precision that would have been impossible to achieve through instant communication, yet felt entirely natural through the patient trust we had built instead. I watched our sensors carefully as we approached, noting the alien fleet's sudden shift in activity as they finally detected our coordinated movement. Ships that had held steady patient positions for days suddenly began scrambling to respond, their confusion evident, even through the limited information our instruments could gather. They had expected chaos from us for days. Instead, chaos finally arrived for them, born not from any failure on our part, but from their own struggle to coordinate a response to a threat their doctrine had never prepared them to face. Grace monitored what limited signals we could detect from their fleet, her expression shifting to quiet fascination as she interpreted the scattered fragments of information reaching our instruments. "Their formations are breaking apart," she said. "Not from damage. From confusion. They don't know how to respond to coordinated action without constant communication guiding every individual ship." I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and something almost like sympathy, understanding exactly what those alien crews must be experiencing in this moment. The very tool they had used to silence us had left them completely unprepared for a coordinated response they had never trained to execute independently. Our approach continued smoothly, each human ship executing its assigned role in the plan, without any need for further confirmation or instruction. I watched as vessels around us began adjusting position exactly as expected, converging on key points along the alien supply lines with a precision that felt almost eerie in its perfection, despite requiring no live communication whatsoever to achieve. Ethan guided the Kestrel Dawn through the final stages of our approach with steady confidence, his calculations proving accurate down to careful margins that would have seemed impossible to maintain without live navigational data feeding him constant updates. "We're on target," he said quietly, "exactly where we planned to be." I nodded, watching our sensors carefully as the operation unfolded exactly according to the framework established days before. There was no need for celebration yet, no moment of triumph to pause and acknowledge. Only the quiet, steady execution of a plan that had proven itself capable of succeeding under conditions specifically designed to prevent success. Grace continued monitoring the fragmented signals reaching our instruments from the alien fleet, providing quiet updates as their confusion deepened further. "They're attempting to restore some form of coordination," she said, "but it's too late for whatever they're trying now. Their formation has already scattered too far to reorganize effectively before we complete our approach." I felt the truth of her words settling over me as our own coordinated action continued unfolding, exactly as planned across the sector. Every human ship, moving independently, yet perfectly aligned with the overall strategy, converging toward objectives established long before any of us had known we would need them. Sophie's voice came quietly from engineering. confirming steady performance from every system aboard our vessel as we completed the final stages of our approach. "Everything holding steady, Commander," she said. "No issues to report." I thanked her quietly, appreciating once again the steady reliability that had carried us through this entire crisis. It occurred to me, watching our ship glide silently through the dark, alongside dozens of others executing the same careful plan, that we had never truly been alone during these long days of silence. We had simply been connected in a way our enemy had never anticipated, bound together not by constant chatter across open channels, but by trust, preparation, and shared understanding built long before any of us had known we would need it. As our formation closed the final distance toward the alien supply lines, I allowed myself a brief moment to consider everything that had led us to this point. Days of quiet adaptation, careful courier runs between distant vessels, patient trust in a doctrine built specifically to survive exactly the situation we now found ourselves navigating. We had not needed a single working signal to accomplish any of it. Grace looked up from her console one final time, before our operation reached its critical stage, her expression calm despite the significance of the moment approaching. "Commander," she said, "we're ready." I looked out at the darkness surrounding us, at the scattered lights of human ships moving with quiet, coordinated purpose toward objectives none of us needed to discuss aloud to understand completely. "So are they," I said quietly, gesturing toward every vessel around us, executing the same careful plan without hesitation. The final approach continued smoothly, each ship playing its part exactly as trained, exactly as trusted, exactly as prepared for during years of doctrine that had finally proven its worth, under conditions specifically designed to defeat it. Whatever came next, I understood clearly that we had already accomplished something remarkable, simply by proving that silence, for humanity, had never truly meant helplessness at all. I watched the tactical display aboard our command vessel with a growing sense of dread that I had never experienced in 300 cycles of service. My name is Veltharu, and in that moment, I finally understood exactly what kind of enemy we had chosen to silence. The human fleet, which had spent days moving with quiet, patient precision that none of us could fully explain, suddenly shifted into something far more decisive. Ships that had appeared to drift with careful purpose now converged rapidly toward our supply lines, each vessel moving with confidence that suggested detailed planning rather than the desperate improvisation we had expected to see days earlier. Korath stood beside me, his expression tightening as he studied the same readings I could hardly bring myself to interpret correctly. "Report," he demanded, his voice sharper than I had heard it in many cycles of service together. "Multiple human vessels converging on our forward supply positions," I said, struggling to keep my own voice steady. "Formation suggests coordinated action, though we have detected no communication signals whatsoever supporting this level of coordination." Korath's frown deepened as he processed this information, clearly wrestling with the same impossible contradiction troubling me. A coordinated fleet action, occurring without any detectable communication making that coordination possible. "Order our forward vessels to intercept," he commanded, turning toward our own communication officers. I watched as the order attempted to propagate through our own fleet, and felt my earlier dread deepen into something closer to genuine alarm. Our jamming field, deployed to silence human communication, had never been perfectly contained to affect only their vessels. Portions of our own formation, spread across such a vast area, struggled to receive clear instructions through the very field we had created to disable our enemy. "Our forward vessels are experiencing delayed response," our communication officer reported, frustration evident in her voice. "The jamming field's edge effects appear to be interfering with our own coordination at this range." Korath's expression shifted from frustration to something closer to genuine concern, an emotion I had rarely witnessed from him throughout our long partnership. "Reduce jamming field radius immediately," he ordered. "Restore full communication capability across our own formation." I understood his reasoning even as I recognized the danger it represented. If our own coordination continued suffering from the jamming field's effects, we risked losing this engagement entirely, regardless of whatever advantage the field might still be providing against the humans. But reducing the field also meant restoring at least partial communication capability to the very enemy we had hoped to keep permanently silenced. The field's radius decreased gradually, as our engineers worked to adjust its parameters, and I watched carefully for any sign that human communication had begun restoring alongside our own improved coordination. What I witnessed instead troubled me more deeply than anything I had observed throughout this entire crisis. Human ships continued their coordinated approach without any visible change in behavior, despite whatever partial signal restoration might now theoretically be possible for them. Whatever coordination they had achieved during days of complete silence apparently required no adjustment now that limited communication might again be technically feasible. "They don't need it anymore," I said quietly, almost to myself. "Whatever they built during our silence, it doesn't depend on us restoring anything." Korath glanced toward me sharply, clearly hearing the words but struggling to accept their implication. "Explain," he demanded. I struggled to organize my thoughts clearly, watching the tactical display continue, showing human forces converging with unwavering precision toward our supply lines. "Their coordination isn't dependent on any signal we can detect or disrupt," I said. "It never was. They built an entire strategy around functioning perfectly well, without communication we could interfere with, using methods so old and simple that our systems were never designed to even recognize them as coordination at all." Korath fell silent, watching the same readings I had been studying, clearly processing the full weight of what this meant for our engagement. Our proven doctrine, tested successfully across countless previous encounters with other species, had encountered an enemy specifically prepared to render that doctrine completely irrelevant. Our forward supply vessels began reporting contact with human strike craft shortly after, their reports arriving in fragments through our still-recovering communication network. The engagement, from what limited information I could gather, proceeded with a precision on the human side that suggested detailed advance planning rather than reactive improvisation under pressure. I watched Korath's expression shift from concern to something closer to grim acceptance as reports continued arriving, each one confirming the same troubling pattern. Human forces, despite having endured complete communication silence for days, were executing their strategy with a coordination that our own forces, even with communication gradually restoring, struggled to match effectively. "How is this possible?" Korath asked, though I suspected he already understood the answer even as he asked the question aloud. I thought carefully before responding, drawing on everything I had learned about human history during my earlier research, information that had seemed merely academic at the time, but now felt disturbingly relevant. Their species has faced this exact scenario throughout its own history, long before they possessed the technology to travel among the stars, I said. They built their entire military doctrine around the assumption that communication would eventually fail, whether through enemy action or simple circumstance. Rather than treating this as an unlikely possibility, they prepared thoroughly to ensure it would never matter, regardless of how completely that communication might be silenced. Korath absorbed this information silently, his gaze fixed on the tactical display showing our forces struggling to respond effectively to an enemy that had transformed our supposed advantage into something closer to irrelevance. "We assumed silence would break them," he said quietly, echoing thoughts I had been wrestling with for days already. "Instead, we discovered a species built specifically to treat silence as simply another condition to prepare for." I nodded slowly, watching additional reports arrive confirming continued difficulty among our own forward vessels as they struggled to counter human strike craft moving with unwavering coordination, despite our best efforts to disrupt whatever we assumed must be enabling that coordination. Our supply lines suffered significant disruption over the following hours, as human vessels executed their strategy with a precision that made clear this outcome had been anticipated and planned for extensively before our fleet had ever arrived in this sector. Every attempt our forces made to adapt and respond seemed to arrive slightly too late, always one step behind an enemy that had apparently already considered and prepared for whatever countermeasures we might attempt. Korath called a full assessment of our fleet's condition as the immediate crisis stabilized somewhat, gathering senior officers to evaluate exactly how thoroughly our proven strategy had failed against this particular enemy. I remember the heavy silence in that assessment meeting, broken only by careful reports detailing the extent of disruption our supply lines had suffered, disruption caused by an enemy fleet that had never once needed the communication network we had worked so hard to silence. Sethrin, the younger analyst who had first spoken the uncomfortable truth days earlier, offered a final observation that none of us could fully dispute. "We spent generations perfecting a strategy built on a single assumption," he said quietly, "that every enemy depends on connection to think clearly. We never considered what might happen against an enemy that spent its own history perfecting the exact opposite skill." Korath did not respond immediately, his gaze remaining fixed on tactical reports that told the same troubling story from every angle we examined them. Our jamming field, our proven doctrine, our confident assumption of victory before the engagement had even properly begun, all of it had proven completely inadequate against a species that had transformed our greatest advantage into something closer to a minor inconvenience they had barely needed to adapt around. I thought during the quiet hours following that difficult assessment about every previous engagement where our strategy had succeeded so completely against other species we had encountered throughout our long history of expansion. Each of those victories had reinforced our confidence in a single, simple truth about warfare among the stars. Cut the signals, and you cut the will to fight effectively. We had never considered, until this exact moment, that somewhere among the countless species scattered throughout the galaxy, one might exist that had built its entire history around ensuring that truth would never apply to them at all. I closed my logs for that difficult cycle with a single observation I hoped future analysts would consider carefully before ever engaging an unfamiliar species, based purely on assumptions drawn from previous victories. Every doctrine, no matter how thoroughly proven through repeated success, eventually encounters an enemy, specifically prepared to render it completely obsolete. We had simply been unfortunate enough, or perhaps unprepared enough, to discover that enemy, in the form of a species that treated silence not as a weapon to fear, but as simply another challenge they had spent their entire history training to overcome. The first thing I noticed, once our operation reached its final stage, was how quiet everything still felt, even as our success became increasingly clear. My name is Mara Voss, and standing on the bridge of the Kestrel Dawn, I watched the alien fleet's confusion deepen into something closer to genuine disarray, exactly as our doctrine had predicted it eventually would. Grace Whitfield monitored the fragmented signals still reaching our instruments, her expression calm despite the significance of what she was reporting. "Their supply lines are severely disrupted, Commander," she said. "Reports from other vessels confirm similar success across every target we identified during our planning phase." I nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction rather than any dramatic sense of triumph. We had not won through some clever trick or sudden burst of inspiration under pressure. We had won by trusting a plan built carefully, long before this crisis began, executed exactly as trained, without ever needing the constant reassurance of open communication to carry it through successfully. Ethan Cole guided our ship carefully through the aftermath of our coordinated action, maintaining the same steady precision he had shown throughout our entire ordeal. "What's our status relative to the rest of the fleet?" I asked. "Holding steady," he said. "Every vessel we've had contact with through courier confirms similar success. We accomplished exactly what we set out to do." Sophie Marsh appeared on the bridge shortly after, her expression reflecting quiet relief rather than exhausted celebration. "All systems remain fully operational, Commander," she said. "Whatever comes next, we're ready for it." I thanked her, appreciating once again the steady competence that had carried us through every stage of this long crisis. It occurred to me that our success had depended just as much on people like Sophie, quietly maintaining our ship's systems without any need for constant confirmation or instruction, as it had on any grand strategic decision made at higher levels of command. Several hours later, as our fleet consolidated its position following the successful operation, something unexpected happened. Grace's console, silent for so many days, suddenly flickered with an incoming signal, weak and fragmented at first, but unmistakably a genuine attempt at communication, rather than the simple prearranged light patterns we had grown accustomed to using among ourselves. "Commander," Grace said, her tone carrying quiet surprise, "I'm receiving an actual signal. It appears to be originating from the alien fleet." I felt a moment of genuine curiosity, mixed with lingering caution, as I considered this development. After days of complete silence, the enemy fleet had apparently decided to restore at least some communication capability, though I could only guess at their reasoning for doing so now, after their strategy had already failed so completely. "Can you translate it?" I asked. Grace worked carefully for several minutes, cross-referencing the fragmented signal against whatever translation protocols our systems still maintained from before the crisis began. "It appears to be a formal request," she said finally. "They're asking for confirmation of our intentions moving forward. It reads almost like they're expecting us to require their guidance before we can determine our own next move." I found myself almost smiling at this, understanding immediately the strange assumption embedded within their message. They had silenced us expecting collapse, and when that collapse failed to arrive, they had apparently assumed we simply needed our own version of a central voice restored before we could decide anything further, the same way their own fleet clearly depended on such coordination to function effectively. "They still don't understand," Ethan said quietly, having listened to Grace's translation with evident interest. I shook my head slowly, watching the tactical display showing our fleet's position, secure and confident following days of coordinated action that had required no restored signal whatsoever to succeed completely. "No," I said. "They don't. And I don't think they will. Not until they truly understand what happened here." Grace prepared a careful response, translated through the same systems that had decoded their original message, explaining simply that our fleet's objectives had already been accomplished according to plans established well before this crisis began, and that no further coordination from their side would be necessary regarding our continued operations. I imagined, sending that message, the confusion it likely caused aboard whatever alien vessel received it, a fleet that had endured complete communication silence for days, confirming calmly that their mission was already complete, having never actually needed the restored signal the enemy had apparently expected them to require. Over the following days, as our fleet regrouped and assessed the full extent of our success, I found myself reflecting often on everything that had led us through this unusual crisis. Days of quiet adaptation, careful courier runs between distant vessels, patient trust in a doctrine built specifically to survive exactly the kind of silence we had endured throughout the entire ordeal. Admiral Halverson sent a formal message through our restored network once enough of our own systems had recovered normal function, praising the coordinated success of every vessel involved in the operation. I read his message carefully, appreciating the quiet pride evident in his careful words. Pride not in any single dramatic achievement, but in the steady, patient execution of a plan built collectively over years of careful preparation. I thought often, during those following days, about Veltharu and the other alien officers who had watched their proven strategy fail so completely against an enemy they had never properly understood. I felt no particular satisfaction in their confusion, only a quiet recognition of how differently two species could approach the same fundamental challenge of coordinating effectively under difficult circumstances. Ethan approached me one final time as our fleet settled into a stable, secure position following the crisis, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Do you think they'll try something like this again?" he asked. "Against another fleet, another species, expecting the same result they expected against us?" I considered his question carefully before responding, understanding the deeper significance behind what he was really asking. "Maybe," I said. "But I hope, wherever this story travels next, that other species learn from what happened here. That silence, properly prepared for, never has to mean helplessness at all." He nodded slowly, seeming satisfied with this answer, and returned to his post as our ship continued its steady, patient recovery from days of unprecedented challenge. Standing alone near the viewport later that evening, watching the stars stretch endlessly beyond our secure formation, I found myself thinking one final time about everything this crisis had taught me about my own fleet, my own species, and the quiet strength we carried within us, long before anyone had ever tested it so thoroughly. We had faced an enemy who believed cutting our voice would cut our will entirely, an assumption that had served them well against countless other species throughout their long history of expansion among the stars. They had never considered, until encountering us directly, that somewhere in the galaxy existed a species that had spent its entire history preparing for exactly this scenario, treating the loss of every signal not as a crisis to fear, but as simply another challenge to train for patiently, long before the day it would ever actually matter. I thought of my old instructor, Daniel Cross, and the words he had repeated so many times during training, that they had eventually become part of who I was as an officer. Words that had carried me and my entire crew safely through the most difficult days of my career so far. The mission does not stop just because the voice giving orders goes quiet. He had been right, more completely than I think even he had fully understood, when he first taught that lesson to a room full of nervous young cadets many years ago. We had proven, through days of patient trust and careful preparation, that connection built through training and shared purpose could accomplish everything that instant communication had once seemed absolutely necessary to achieve. Grace joined me quietly near the viewport as our ship settled into its final rest period following the crisis, her expression calm and thoughtful. "They still don't understand what they're truly facing," she said quietly, echoing thoughts I had been considering myself throughout the evening. I looked out at the stars, thinking of every human ship scattered safely across the sector, each one having proven, through quiet, patient action, that silence was never truly the weapon our enemy had believed it to be. "They will," I said quietly. "Eventually, every species that tries to silence us learns the same lesson. We were never depending on the signal in the first place. We were only ever depending on each other, and that connection, built through trust and careful preparation long before any crisis ever arrives, is something no jamming field will ever be able to touch." Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of our secure formation, an alien fleet continued adjusting to a defeat they were only beginning to fully understand. And somewhere closer, aboard dozens of quiet, steady human ships scattered safely across the sector, crews who had faced complete silence without ever once losing their way, continued their steady work, confident, capable, and completely unafraid of a darkness that had tried, and failed, to become their nightmare.